We're joined now from Glasgow by Scotland's First Minister and the leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, to discuss this film and more. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to start on the film from East Renfrewshire, because I spoke to a lot of people who voted for the Conservatives last time, but they don't like the Brexit policy, who voted for Labour last time, but they're not convinced by Jeremy Corbyn. This is a seat, of course, where people voted to remain in the Union in the independence referendum. I just wonder if you're worried that by putting independence at the heart of this election, you might be putting off some of these voters who are looking for an alternative but don't want to see an independent Scotland.
No, I'm not, and frankly there's no evidence of that in opinion polls in Scotland. I think people are very clear about the reasons for voting SNP. Firstly, if you don't want Boris Johnson to win a majority in this election, then the SNP is the main challenger in all of these Tory-held seats, including East Renfrewshire, so vote SNP to stop Boris Johnson. If you want to escape Brexit, the SNP has been the most consistently pro-Remain party in Scotland, so that's a vote to escape the mess of Brexit. And then, yes, of course, if you vote SNP, you're voting to put Scotland's future into Scotland's hands. Now, whether you support independence or oppose independence or aren't yet decided on independence, what you're voting for is the proposition that it should be people in Scotland who make the decisions about our future, not politicians at Westminster like Boris Johnson. And my experience of this election, although I take nothing for granted, there's a long way to go, is that that message is resonating very strongly in every part of the country.
Well, not long to find out how well that message is going down. We are potentially, of course, waiting for the result. We are waiting for the results of the election. If there is a hung parliament, I'm interested to know what would be the SNP's red lines in any discussions you have with other parties about offering them a way into number 10?
Well, first of all, a hung parliament with the SNP holding the balance of power would give Scotland maximum influence. So that would be a pretty good outcome, I think, in terms of making sure Scotland's voice is heard. My first red line is that I would never, ever put Boris Johnson into Downing Street, because I've seen up close and over too many years the damage Conservative governments do to the kind of communities I grew up in. In terms of supporting a minority Labour government, I've been clear that we wouldn't have a formal coalition. It would be a less formal arrangement. And yes, of course, I would expect Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party to respect Scotland's right to choose our own future. But there are other matters that I would want to progress as well. Stopping Brexit, obviously, but a real end to austerity until such times as Scotland is independent, devolution of powers over migration and employment so that we can protect workers' rights, for example, an end to the misery of universal credit and welfare cuts and the rape clause and two-child cap, better pensions. So these are the policies, progressive policies, that I think resonate strongly in Scotland, but actually resonate strongly with many people right across the UK.
In 2015, you said that scrapping Trident, Britain's nuclear deterrent, would also be a red line in any discussions. Is that the same this time around?
Yeah, so absolutely. That's another matter that we would absolutely be firm about. And that's tied, if you like, to some of these other policies because, I'll be very clear, I have a moral objection to weapons of mass destruction. Unlike Joe Swinson, I wouldn't be prepared to press a nuclear button that would kill potentially millions, tens of millions of people. But there's also the opportunity costs of Trident, the billions, tens of billions of pounds that are required to renew Trident, in my view, are better spent on stronger conventional defence that is more effective to protect our country, but also on hospitals and schools and better social security provision. And these are the choices that we should be thinking very carefully about. And, if the SNP is in that position of influence, then these are absolutely the kind of policies that we will pursue.
So just to be crystal clear on this, scrapping Trident would be a red line in any discussions with Labour that you may have?
I thought I was crystal clear on that. I've been campaigning against Trident for all of my life. So yes, that is absolutely a key position that the SNP would have in any discussions about supporting a minority Labour government.
You say that you want more devolution of powers as well. The SNP conference voted to decriminalise controlled drugs. Is that the kind of thing that you would like to see devolved in these discussions, if, as you say, it would give Scotland such influence?
Yes, we would want power over drugs law to be devolved. Obviously, it would then be up to a Scottish Parliament to decide how exactly to use that power. One of the issues that we have been pushing for and have had discussions, so far unsuccessful discussions with Westminster, is to have the power to allow Glasgow City Council, for example, to establish what's called a safe consumption facility to try to reduce the harms associated with drug use and to help us, along with all of the other things we're doing, to reduce the death toll from drug misuse. So these are absolutely all things we would want to progress. And what we're doing here, I think, in this discussion is illustrating just how much more powerful Scotland's position would be if we were in that position. But the first step in that is to deny Boris Johnson a majority. And going back to where we started in seats like East Renfrewshire, whether you voted SNP in the past or not, if you voted Labour or Lib Dem or whoever, if you want to stop Boris Johnson, then voting SNP, the main challengers in these seats, is the only way to do that.
We heard from John McDonnell a little earlier in the programme, and I asked him about the idea of the Scottish independence referendum. He said it wouldn't be something that a Labour government would grant in the first 2 to 3 years. Is that an acceptable position if you were to go into these negotiations?
No, my position, and the one that I would expect Labour to respect if they wanted SNP support, is that the question of if there is an independence referendum and the timing of that is down to the Scottish Parliament to decide, not Westminster. But I'd ask people to consider this and sort of think ourselves into the 13th of December, and Labour are in a position, against what all the opinion polls might be suggesting, to form a minority government, and they need the support of the SNP. Are they really going to turn their back on the chance to stop austerity, to stop welfare cuts, get rid of universal credit, just because they want to block the right of the Scottish people to decide their own future and argue over a couple of years? I mean, I think the reason Jeremy Corbyn is getting himself into a mess on this, with his position changing all the time, is actually he knows within himself that the only democratically defensible position here is to say, for him, he might oppose independence, he might not want there to be another referendum, but actually it's not for Westminster to decide these things, it's for the Scottish people through their democratically elected Scottish Parliament to decide these things. I think that's the position Jeremy Corbyn knows is right, and I don't think he's going to turn his back on all of these other things he wants to do as with a Labour government, just because he's so determined to block the right of the Scottish Parliament to decide the timing of a referendum.
You've previously described Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn as completely and utterly useless. Now, you've been very clear that you wouldn't put Boris Johnson into number 10. So why would you help put Jeremy Corbyn into a number 10 if you think he's completely and utterly useless?
Look, Sophie, I mean, I don't think I'm telling anybody anything that they haven't heard me say before. Neither of these guys would be my choice as Prime Minister. I've made my views clear on Boris Johnson. I wouldn't choose Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, but I don't get to choose the leader of the Labour Party. And if we are in a position of a hung Parliament with the SNP holding the balance of power, a good position as we've just been talking about, then sometimes you have to be prepared to choose between the devil and the deep blue sea. So it's not my choice, but you have to choose what you think you can make the most progress and get the most progress in the kind of policies, priorities and values. And I would say to people, and there are many of them in Scotland as across the rest of the UK, who have real concerns about Jeremy Corbyn, then better to have the SNP in there, keeping him on the right track or a better track than have him without that. So, whatever way you look at this, getting SNP MPs in there, stopping Boris Johnson getting a majority and making sure the right policies, priorities and values are to the fore is the best way to vote in this election.
Now, just finally, transparency in politics is, of course, really important. And there have been claims recently that you avoid using the Scottish Government email system, and that officials may also be using private emails, perhaps using your SNP address or private addresses, which of course would potentially avoid scrutiny and freedom of information requests. Is that right?
No, it's not. It's emphatically not the case. I mean, there's been a lot of nonsense talked about this. I do government business in exactly the same way as my predecessors have done it, the same way government ministers have done it for a long, long time. I think the current guidance around all of this dates back to 2004 or 5. I've never changed it. Any government business I do is subjected to freedom of information legislation, regardless of the platform that I do it on. So, you know, there's been a lot of attempts to suggest that there is something untoward here, but absolutely. In fact, interestingly, the reason that my opponents in Scotland know about emails from an SNP address is because they were released under freedom of information requests. So, you know, there is complete transparency here, and, you know, what other parties are talking about is complete and utter nonsense.
You say that everything is, that all of your communication, no matter what the platform, is subjected to these freedom of information requests. And you've also said that you make handwritten notes sometimes, rather than doing everything electronically.
No,
hold
on.
Is that right? What happens to those notes afterwards?
Let me explain, because ministers, if you talk to a UK government minister, what you get boxes, government boxes with written paper submissions inside, and I will write on it, yes, I'm happy with that, or no, I'm not happy with that, or amend this bit. Goes back to my private office. My private office take my handwritten note or instruction, type that into an email, and send it back to the official. That's how it gets disseminated within the civil service, and that's how government business has been done for as far back as I can remember. The idea that this is some kind of system I have introduced is just ridiculous, and any government minister hearing what I've just described will know that that's exactly how they do government business.
So what happens to the notes afterwards? Because I think my understanding is that, say, for example, Boris Johnson's notes are retained because, I mean, in September, it was a handwritten note from the Prime Minister that showed that he'd agreed to suspend Parliament.
Yeah. So this is about, I told you about 2004-05, that the guidance on record keeping, which is sent to the Registers of Scotland every year, where it's the electronic copy of the note that is kept rather than the handwritten copy of the note. That's not a system I have introduced. That's a system that was introduced actually before there was even an SNP government in Scotland. So I haven't changed it in any way. I do it the way it's been done since that far back. So there is nothing here that is different to how others have done government business. And you know, the record of that, the electronic record of that, is open to freedom of information. And you know, there is a lot of information released from the Scottish Government as from the UK Government, and the idea that that is not completely transparent is just nonsense.
OK, Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much. I can see quite a lot of Ian Rankin books there behind you. Are you looking forward to getting back to those at the end of the election campaign?
I always look forward to getting back to my books.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much for being on the programme today.
Thank you.